What's going on, guys, and welcome to episode 56 of the Book Binge, where this week we are talking about something a little bit different, but somewhat similar in format to last week's review, being A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Writings by Charles Dickens. Sorry about the glare on that. My lighting isn't the best in the world, but at least you can see the cover in the first place. Like I mentioned last week, I did a review of a collection of short stories within The Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio. How about something that's, like I said, a similar format, but a little bit more festive since I just read it recently for the Christmas season? Let's check out the quality of Dickens's writings, starting off just as I normally would with the good of A Christmas Carol, since that is the most iconic story in here. It might be the only iconic piece of writing within this collection, depending on how much you know about Dickens. But it is also the title story, so that is the one that I'm going to talk about in this section. Clearly, A Christmas Carol is a classic for a reason, and like I mentioned, very iconic for a reason, and as everybody well knows, it is super adaptable. The amount of stage plays that are, made based off of this, they're musical movie adaptations, there's just normal film adaptations. It is really easy to adapt because it is very short and concise, has a point, and goes through each of those points beat by beat. And then, creators of adaptations are able to add in little bits here and there, depending on what they're feeling, that are able to add a little bit of personal flair, I suppose, to the story, which is really nice. And as that kind of hints at, it isn't really just a Christmas story. A Christmas Carol isn't just a story about Christmas. It is a story about Christmas with a moral to it, which is really neat. As somebody who personally loves the Christmas season, it really works for me because I'm somebody who's always been festive when it comes to this particular holiday. And in terms of people who like to be downers on the mood during this particular season, it's always unfortunate whenever you have people like that doing that kind of thing. So having a story where pretty much the express point is turning Ebenezer Scrooge into somebody who isn't as much of a downer about the season and isn't as much of a downer, generally speaking, learning to appreciate life as a whole, not just the season, but people around him and his time. That's something that is really, really nice about the story. And furthermore, along those lines, the best part about A Christmas Carol to me reading it is just how much thematic potency that really worked for me there is in it, especially in the last couple staves where the amount of thought-provoking nature to it was really, really, really high. And I thought that I just thought the story was, generally speaking, very profound for me. Being such an old one and being one that there's been a million adaptations of, I wasn't quite expecting that coming out of the story. But let's move on to the bad of A Christmas Carol. I grew up personally with a 1970 musical adaptation that was amazing with, I want to say it was Albert Finney being Ebenezer Scrooge. So if you look that up, you should be able to find the adaptation that I'm thinking of. It's just called Scrooge. It is a musical, but there's little enough music in it that I actually only outright remember two sections of it where it is a musical. The rest of, the songs within it, I genuinely don't remember. I didn't really realize or remember it being an outright musical. That's perfectly fine. It has been a while since I've watched it. But that was an adaptation that I grew up with, so I was very familiar with the story going into the reading process of it because of that. And it almost lives up to that, but because of what I mentioned earlier with the story being really adaptable, really easy to kind of add stuff in, the little flares that my adaptation, as I'll refer to it, my adaptation, the one that I grew up with, the little flares that that version had that the original story didn't, meant that there were a couple small points in a couple of the different staves of it that I didn't really get. I don't know, that just didn't hit me quite the same way because I was wanting a little bit more expansion. The section of the story involving the third ghost particularly is where this is quite evident and where the most iconic And honestly, the most fun track of the musical that I grew up watching has a thank you very much from that movie. If you go onto YouTube and look up Scrooge thank you very much song, you should be able to find that clip. It is a very fun song, but that portion of this particular film and the stuff that immediately follows it before moving on into the next portion of the story is something that I've always remembered in my, over the years, and especially as Christmas season comes and goes, that's something that I always recall is that particular scene. It doesn't really appear in that much detail in the story, and it's not necessarily a knock on A Christmas Carol, the story, because, that was an adaptation that occurred well over 100 years after it was written, right? I'm going to double check that real quick. I don't think this was written too late in the 1800s. Yeah, so like, 130 something years after A Christmas Carol was initially published, there's going to be some things that are a little bit different about it. And when it comes down to it, I think that's pretty much the only aspect of A Christmas Carol that I think I could ever say is quote unquote bad, is just the fact that it doesn't quite live up to the adaptation in my mind because of the way the adaptation expands on it. But even as such, the thematic potency that I mentioned before of it was so good that it may not have lived to the adaptation in that way in terms of the story, but the thought-provoking nature of it outgrew and exceeded the adaptation in my mind. So that's something that I guess I can grant towards A Christmas Carol's favor, even with this small point of me just saying it's not quite as good as probably the adaptation that you grew up watching, whichever version it was. In terms of the ugly, well, spoopy ghosts is all I will say about that. The movie that I've been talking about all the way up to this point had those portions of it that scared the crap out of me as a kid. But seriously, though, the story is great. I absolutely recommend giving it a shot. But let's talk about some of the other Christmas writings, and there's a lot of them. I'm basically more or less just going to read through this particular section as if from the portions that I talked about them from my Goodreads review, just to make my life easier. There's a few writings within the collection called Christmas Festivities, one called A Christmas Tree, another one called What Christmas Is As We Grow Older. Sorry, What Christmas Is As We Grow Older. There we go. English is hard. And then another one called The Seven Poor Travelers. They're all relatively mixed for me, those writings were, because they kind of like draw a line between story and writing in a vague manner that I had a hard time truly understanding personally, in terms of both what I was reading, let alone what I was supposed to get out of them, especially since the age of these writings and Dickens's prose is, it's not obtuse. I'm not going to say it's obtuse, but it is definitely, it's probably the most archaic prose that I've read up to this point. Since the middle of 2021, it is the most archaic prose. So in ways they were just a little bit tough to get through and there wasn't a whole lot I got out of them. There was another story called A Christmas Episode from Master Humphrey's Clock, which was just a chapter from one of Dickens's other novels. The impact of the story as such wasn't really high. I think it would have been better if I were to just read whatever it's called, Master Humphrey's Clock, at some point in time and just got the chapter within it. The fact that it was taken out and put in this just because it involves Christmas is a little bit weird because there's no context for it. So there's a lot of this just like, well, what in the world is even the point of this, So it just kind of feels weird and out of place, especially considering the fact that I actually forgot about the story's existence in this collection in the first place until about 5 seconds ago when I was reading it off of here, and when I had copied my notes over from Goodreads into here. Like, I had completely forgot that the story existed because it's just kind of a nothing burger in the collection. However, let's talk a little bit more positively about a few things now. There is a short story early on in the collection called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton, and I thought it was delightful. It was both delightful in its brevity and in its charm. The dismal storyline still had a kind of light and charming and weird kind of nature to it in a somewhat kind of twisted way. Was nearly the fastest reading story of anything in this collection. I really enjoyed it. Really short. It's kind of silly, all things considered, but I thought that the story was really fun, so kind of like an easy 5-star for me. in that regard. And then there's the other major story in the collection that isn't obviously A Christmas Carol, and that is The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain. This was a special story for me. It's made up of 3 chapters, and all 3 of those chapters are actually quite long. But chapters 2 and 3 weren't quite as amazing as chapter 1 was for me, but the whole story did culminate in something unexpected and very thought-provoking, but especially chapter 1, which is one of my favorite chapters that I read in 2022, actually. It was very good, and probably my single favorite part of the entire collection. Chapter 1 of The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain is up there with staves 4 and 5 of A Christmas Carol. I really love chapter 1. If the story had just been chapter 1, it probably would have been easily the favorite thing in the collection because it was just so thought-provoking for me. There was so much going on in there in ways that just made me think, something that very little of the rest of anything in this collection did. So I really liked that. I would say The Haunted Man is more like a 4-star story, but chapter 1 is like a 6 out of 5. I just really enjoyed that. But let's talk about my recommendation of A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Writings by Charles Dickens. I definitely recommend A Christmas Carol, the story of the goblins who stole a sexton, and The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain. Those 3 stories are fantastic. Everything else in the collection is, I suppose you can go ahead and try reading them for yourself and see what you get out of them if you desire. But as for me, there's nothing worth it with those. They just kind of felt like a waste of my time that I could have read something else at the end of this year or at the end of 2022 instead. So if I ever reread any of these stories, which honestly I might decide to do as kind of a Christmas tradition, I'm probably going to reread A Christmas Carol, potentially chapter 1 of The Haunted Man, as well every year. But most everything else I'm not going to be rereading. So take that recommendation as you will. It was cool to see all the writings in here, but many aren't really worth it. And coming to the end of this video, thank you guys for watching. I just want to give a quick shout out to my own novella that I just finished writing pretty recently. At the time that this video is coming out, I want to say it was about a week and a half ago that I finished editing and finished releasing the entirety of Beneath Perfection on seasonalproductions.com/beneath-perfection. I would greatly appreciate anybody who is willing to go check that out, especially since I am super happy and proud of that piece of work. Easily my most polished work, and it is on an entirely different level of quality compared to everything else that I've written before. Not that anything that I wrote before that was necessarily very good, so it's not like there's too much reference for that, but it is on another level of quality that I'm very happy with. So if you want to check that out, you are absolutely free to do so. Free as in it is available on my website for free. Don't have to pay anything, no ads, no anything like that. So with that all being said, I will see you guys on Thursday for part 3 of my 2022 reading tier list is what it is. Covering more of the books that I read over the course of 2022 and ranking them against all of the rest. That's something that I was having a lot of fun with recording, and I hope you guys have been enjoying the first couple parts up to this point. But I'll also see you guys next week for my January reading wrap up and February TBR. So if you guys are excited for that, stick around and you'll get to see those within the week. Thank you guys for watching again. I'll see you guys then.